My name's Ginny Morrow and I'm presenting today on children's work, care and school in young lives, findings from our 15-year longitudinal study of childhood poverty. So I'm going to outline our 5 key headline findings from Young Lives. Firstly, that children's participation in paid work has declined in 3 out of our 4 study countries. Secondly, children spend more time in school now than they were, and they spend less time consequently in paid and unpaid work. Thirdly, types of work that children undertake are specific to context. They're also shaped by gender, household composition and birth order. Fourthly, we found that work may to an extent support children's skill development. It may sometimes enable children to go to school, but it also may interfere with schooling, which causes difficulties for children. And finally, I'll briefly mention social protection schemes and the fact that these have affected children's time use. Okay, overall in Young Lives, we've seen a decline in children's involvement in paid work. And I'm taking paid work here as the example because so many children do other forms of work that it's difficult to see variation. It's really important to state that education is very highly valued by parents and children in all 4 countries. Children want to go to school and their families want them to attend school. And over time in Young Lives, we found that initially, when we started the study, numbers of 8-year-olds reporting working for pay were pretty low, and this trend away from work for very young paid work for very young children continued. And the table below, however, shows rates of 15-year-olds working for pay. These have also declined, with the exception for Vietnam. So I'll let you just look at the table, and you can see there that in the period between 2009 and 2016, the numbers of children aged 15 working for pay gradually decreased. In Vietnam, we're not entirely sure why this may be the case. It could be that this is mostly boys, and that there are low-skilled job opportunities available that young men are choosing to take, or their families are encouraging them to take. So they leave school earlier and take these low-paid jobs. So if we look at the next 2 slides, here I'm going to compare children's time use for the older cohort of Young Lives children who were aged 15 in 2009, and the following slide is going to compare those 15-year-olds in 2016. So for these slides, we're actually looking at work as including all kinds of work. That means paid and unpaid, inside and outside the household. And if we look at the slides, we can see that Ethiopian boys and girls work much more than the other countries at all ages. We can also see that for all countries, the hours per day worked increase with age. Although, for example, by age 5, children in Ethiopia are working the same amount of time as 15-year-olds in India, 11-year-olds in Peru, and 12-year-olds in Vietnam. But if we skip through to the following slide, we can see that children are spending much more time in schooling, in education. So education here means schooling and homework. And India here appears to be a very marked outlier. Again, we're not sure why this is, but we do note that there have been very powerful anti-child labour campaigns in India. Okay, moving on to the next slide. It's pretty obvious, really, but types of work are highly specific to context. The majority of children reported increasing involvement in domestic work and work on family farms as they grow up over time. This isn't really surprising. But what we're also able to show in Young Lives is that gender, household composition and birth order are very important. So here's a quote from a young girl in Ethiopia who explains to the researchers, "I started working when I was very small. I was herding the livestock because I was the last born child in the family and we did not have a boy." So sibling composition is very important. If we move on now to look at the time spent on unpaid care work, we can also see from the slide here that the time that girls spent on unpaid care work increased sharply between ages 12 to 22. So these give you some indications of the variation in children's work that we see in Young Lives. Do we turn now to our qualitative research? We can see quite a complex picture emerging. And the first thing I need to say is it's vital to acknowledge that working has very negative consequences for children, including injuries, exhaustion, conflicting with school attendance, and so on. However, we found that children and families balance their present needs with their anticipated future outcomes. And family members, to a very significant extent, depend upon each other and rely upon each other for work tasks to be completed. But work has other meanings for children, so work is a source of pride and blessings. It's part of being a good child in many cultures. And here's a quote from a young man in rural India who explains that his mother has told him, "Look, you are a blessed one. You're being looked after by your son, and there's no need for you to work." He's not only earning, the people in the community tell her, but he's also taking care of you. And the boy explains, "I felt very happy. I want to get a good name. I still want to work hard and do better things." It's also clear that children learn from their work as well as learning at school. And it's clear that parents and children realise that the skills they learn through work are important as a backup if schooling and education fails to lead to improved prospects. So families and children are being quite cautious here. And here's a 15-year-old boy in India who says, "As it is, we're not sure of getting employment after completion of education, so we cannot depend on one source for employment alone. We have to take up studies and work simultaneously during holidays," in his case. But we also see in our qualitative data that, for example, the skills that girls learn through domestic work are important for marriage later on. That's also especially noticeable in India, but also in Ethiopia. So it's not that work is entirely detrimental, and children and families realise this. So work also sometimes enables children to go to school. And this works in various ways, and we have numerous examples, but I'll just pick two here to show you. So here's Mulu, a young woman in Ethiopia who started school at the age of 8. By the age of 12, she was working picking haricot beans. It's interesting to note that working for her didn't actually seem to be as detrimental as it may have been, because by 2014, she was anticipating taking a university entrance exam. She said to the researchers, "If I didn't have a job, I couldn't have attended class because I would have had a financial constraint. Our standard of living has improved since I started work." We've also found that in some cases, children are working in order to support their siblings in their education. Here's Lien from Vietnam, a young woman. She was stitching shopping bags at home, working with her father in construction work. And interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, she was attending university at age 19. But at one point she said, "Back then, my family was short of money. I lent that money to my sister for her tuition fees." But it's also very clear that work is problematic for children, and it interferes with schooling, and in many different ways. So as I said already, aspirations for schooling are very high, but we have found that children are punished when they miss school for work. And here's a young girl from India talking about how when she goes back to school having worked, she's punished by her teachers using corporal punishment. So she says, "I get hurt if teachers scold me. Sometimes they also beat us. Madam beats us more. She sometimes beats with a stick. If we do not complete our homework, she beats. She beats if we're not regular to school." And here she's talking about missing school for work. Okay, it's also clear that social protection schemes affect children's time use, though this has changed over time. And in India and Ethiopia, we found that older children were, to an extent, drawn into social protection work. But as I say, this has changed and seems to have become less. And in India, for example, we found that, and here's a quote, previously when parents are unable to work, then children of 15 or 16 years will do it, but now they're being told that children are not to be included, and this is an offence. So thank you for listening, and if you'd like to find out more, please visit Young Lives' website. And this presentation is based on a summative paper which pulls together Young Lives' findings on work, school and learning.